We'll just go with a top of mind, at least for me, a news item we woke up to this morning. Some may have seen it. Poland this morning just saying that they shot down Russian drones that entered airspace. These are the sorts of headlines that maybe if you're a casual consumer of the news, you see from time to time, and you don't quite have the appropriate context to know what to do with that bit of news. But I'm curious from you experts, as you see another headline like that just a few hours before we take the stage, how do you think about it, and how do you think the average citizen should think about or approach that sort of story?
I think there's a couple of points. I just want to pick up on something that was said earlier, and I think coming to the investment side and Europe, if we think of the largest spender in Europe potentially, which is Germany, they have a lot of money and they just don't know how to burn it fast enough. So they've got plenty of money. And of course, when you talk to what should we be doing next, I think releasing our minds from the fact that these individual countries are individual and they will protect their interests, they will protect their IP. Europe isn't a place, it's a construct of multiple countries with national interests. So that's number one. The threat that we talk about now is really, I think, a sharp reminder that we have to act faster. We have to team faster because it's just on our doorstep. And that's one thing you do notice. The further west you move, the slower things go. The further east you move really fast. Decision times. And we've got to learn that in our procurement, in our planning, in our operational readiness, in how we develop products. Think of the east and what threats they see. What are they thinking today in Poland?
Right.
What are they thinking today?
Yeah. Anyone else?
And I think as well, what it just says to me is that I think it's going to put more of an emphasis, the focus on all the things we've been saying. Collaboration, how do we go quicker? How do we get better capability? Because that's one example, and now it's becoming real. I think that probably in the past, maybe the public could see that there was something in Ukraine. Now this is becoming much wider spread potentially, then I think it's a very real thing. And I think that, if anything, the way I look at it is this is where we need to accelerate. How do we accelerate is the answer here. And I think we all mentioned about collaboration. That's great, but what does that really mean? Because governments can do certain things, primes can do certain things, but I believe strongly that there's a need to really collaborate at the lower tiers. Because that, I think, is where you get the speed. I think that's really where you get the agility and such like, and that's where you get the technology. So I think that we really need to think about it in a very different way. It can't all just be the governments, with the responsibility. I think it's the whole industry. This is all about the industrial base and how do we kind of build it up. And I think that it's a holistic view that really goes all the way as deep as necessary. So in answer to your question, I think it's just going to put a even keener focus once we saw what happened yesterday.
Yeah. Lieutenant Colonel Otten, please.
Yeah, sure, thanks. It's just another wake-up call.
Yeah.
It's a wake-up call, and I'll kind of dovetail a lot of comments that were made here. You mentioned sovereign, IP and countries, and that's actually one of the barriers. That's a barrier right now for industry. If industry thinks that, for example, if they produce something for a given state in Europe, and that they're going to have a challenge then selling that to another state, that's a barrier for entry that will then limit us growing our European industrial base. So that is a problem. And to your point, this is not just, it's not just government, it's not just military. It's a societal thing to understand, there's a decision to be made amongst the allied industrial base in Europe. Do we need to be on, I'm not going to answer this, but do we need to be on a wartime footing? If so, does that mean that our government should maybe be more transparent with society on the status of things? I think the general public might find that if they really knew the readiness levels of their militaries and their ministries of defense, they probably wouldn't be as happy. Yeah. And so there's a balance, though, and I understand, I'm not a politician, but I do wonder that sometimes. Like if you pull the curtain back, maybe the voters will be a little more in favor of more defense spending, because we do see the threat, like you mentioned in the news this morning.
I think you'd be a good politician, by the way, for whatever it's worth, if you ever want to make a run for office. Trevor, go ahead.
I just would make two. I find the news you mentioned alarming because there are two possible explanations. One is that the incursion was deliberate and they were pushing the borders, and that is alarming. The other is that it was not deliberate, that it was some kind of accidental, which shows poor command and control in Russia. Yeah. And both of those, whichever of those explanations you think is prominent, then both of them are worrying, because the risk of accidental escalation from from unintended actions is really something we have to think about. So I find it alarming. It is another wake-up call, but there isn't any comfortable explanation as to why it happened.
If I could just riff on that a little bit, Trevor, that you mentioned just now, those points, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think we've seen more incidents like this. I tend to sort of sound paranoid, but I tend to think it's probably not accidental. And Mr. Putin's regime is just trying each time to have a little look at how far can I push this. If it is a command and control error on the part of Russia, that is alarming, but I would also argue that potentially opens up opportunities for us as NATO, because a command and control failing by one party or by one belligerent is an opportunity for the other belligerent to work out that's a weakness. How can we exploit it? How can we use that as a center of gravity? One thing I've noticed, I spend a lot of time up in Baltic and very close to the southern border, the Russian border in south Estonia. And the feeling there is palpable. And people don't say if there's a war with Russia, they say when the war with Russia comes. There is almost an acceptance of an inevitability of it. And I would agree with what all of you were mentioning in your own way, that what you actually need is a whole of society approach to this. It's not just a case of we'll do this and do that. And an industrial policy, industrial strategy is a maneuver element in its own right. It's a war-winning weapon in its own right. And that's something I'd be keen to articulate to voters.
Yeah. I'm curious from each of you gentlemen, if you're comfortable, if you had to give a grade, A through F, of Europe's current readiness, what grade would you give it? And I'll leave that open to whoever wants to take that first, if anyone wants to take that first.
Well, it's a question of readiness for what? Yeah.
Sure.
And I think, there's a psychological position as well, So I'm pretty much in the C area, but it's trending upwards. But whether it's trending upwards fast enough and more thoroughly enough, I've got some doubts. There are the financial questions about defence are they're coloured by the overall financial conditions of the country. I think Rachel Reeves is speaking here later today, and in the Cold War, we spent much more on defence, and our economy continued to grow. Yeah, it doesn't say that defence will boost the economy necessarily. It doesn't prevent growth, and we need to get that sort of back into the equation in some way. But I would give it a C.
I'd go C minus. The reason I say that is I've spent some time in and around Europe looking at the readiness, not only of people, but of fleets of vehicles. I was in one large MOD not that long back, and they said, we've got a massive fleet of armored vehicles, but only 20% is ready to move. Think about that. And so part of the mission that my particular company is on is raising that readiness. Is it 95% availability? And you take the F-35 platform, that's not fully readily available. Take any platform you like across Europe. There's a lot of work to do to be ready to do that unquestionable next step. But we could be a D quite quickly. It could be a B quite quickly. I think we have, must try harder.
All right, fair enough. Please.
That's a good point on readiness, and I think we should include on that personnel readiness.
Correct.
Because you look at actually, the strength of your forces, number of troops, sailors, Marines, airmen, etc. There is a readiness level to those as well, and I think we'd be surprised sometimes to see how those readiness levels look. Sometimes not nearly as good as you think. Who's on holiday, who's on leave, medical, whatnot, still in training. They're not ready, and they don't count in the books. I'm not in a position to where I'm going to grade another country's military on how they're doing, because also it's subjective to what is the threat against that was mentioned. But I will say that it's trending positively. We are making slow strides. I think the increase in budgets, the increase of industry engagement, the increase of capital engagement, like we're making progress. I would like to make faster progress. I'm a Marine, I'm a pilot. I like to go fast. We'll see.
Fair enough.
For me, I think it depends what you call Europe, because I think the parts of Europe, I think, are very ready. I think Steve made a great point earlier, that the further east you go, the more ready people are, because the threat is more imminent. The further west you go, then it feels less of an urgent thing. So I think if you look at, say, some of the, in the Scandinavia area and places like that, I'd say that they are extremely ready. If you look at Europe as a whole, we work across pretty well every single country in Europe, and there's a wide variety of capability and readiness and things like that. And I think, to me, that's an area that we need to really focus on.
Okay, great. Anyone else? Only if you like.
I would, I think I'm on readiness to absorb an initial Russian attack in the Baltic.
Yeah.
I put it about a B-. I mean, if you look at, again, going back to Estonia, the other side of that border, you've got the Russian city of Pskov, and you've got a lot of Russian airborne units that are based there. Now, Russia keeps its airborne troops as a separate service, and they're considered the crack troops of the Russian Federation. But I would not want to be Russian airborne forces going up against the battle groups we've got there, UK-led battle groups, the French ones, German ones, etc. I think our fighting readiness and our deployments there are excellent. What worries me is how quickly can we reinforce those? We're back almost to the Fulda Gap scenario. Yeah, we know that we've got the 3 days to halt the Soviet shock army and to try and keep them in place and slow them down. But then we're dependent not just on the US, but elsewhere in Europe, about getting those troops to the front line very, very quickly. And that's where I'm more D- territory.
Yeah, I just pick up on this point made really well about the people readiness. Yeah. Because we've got fleets of vehicles perhaps ready and ships and whatever platform you like. We don't have the trained people yet coming through. We could sustain 1 or 2 bouts. After that, where are the people?
Well, to your point, though, so when I answered the question, I didn't put in the calculus the U.S. as well. I was answering just as Europe, and
Right.
I think that's a good distinction.
Right.
Absolutely.
You know, if things went really bad in the world, for example, and my country unfortunately was tied up in a different theater, you know, then how well could Europe do? And I think that's what we need to be prepared for, because factually we've all reduced our defense budgets over the years. The U.S. was at 6% GDP once upon a time, and now it's just over 3% GDP. So yeah, we're trending positively, but we need not stop. It needs to continue to trend positively.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Well, I would like to add in the resource question, because if you ask a sort of simple question about in resource terms, should Europe be able to deter Russia, then the answer is pretty clear. We ought to be able to do that. Certainly, I would leave aside the nuclear piece, but the conventional piece. I mean, in terms of total GDP per capita, high technology expertise, where you stand on the corruption index, all those sorts of things. Russia is a backward state. Yeah. So if we can't, if sort of our current military can tell us we can't deter Russia, just Britain, France, and Germany together have got many more resources. There's a bit of me that says, okay, you're going to need a transition, but if you can't deter Russia, let's get somebody who knows, got some idea how to do it, because in resource terms, we certainly ought to be able to do it. There is no comparison. Russia is a very backward state.
For sure. Thank you, gentlemen. As a reminder, if you're in the audience, and thank you for coming out this morning, everyone's caffeinated and excited, you can scan the QR code, send our distinguished panelists your questions. Speaking of, we've already got a few of them, so I'll kick one out. We'll go from a bit of a focus maybe on the eastern side of Europe to a bit up north. Michael Harding asks, what are your views on the alliance of northern nations to protect Arctic sovereignty? What does that look like in terms of the border? It's an issue to some degree being litigated back where I come from in the United States, an increased interest, of course, from the incumbent administration on Greenland, access to the Arctic Circle. What does defense and readiness for Europe look like in that theater, so to speak, of the conversation?
I don't think I got the whole questions. I am not caffeinated this morning. I'm just going right into it. I can just say on a personal note, I am absolutely ecstatic to have Sweden and Finland join the NATO alliance. I have quite a lot of time working with the Finnish, and I've loved every moment of it. It's a fantastic professional military organization, and quite a robust reserve force as well. And there's no one I'd rather have on my side on that front than the Finnish.
That's terrific. Thank you.
I can kind of talk from, we do a lot of work in that part of the world, and I think that the state of readiness and I think that the capability there is exceptional. I think that they really reacted extremely quickly. I think that they're really driving the right way, and they are working in a true alliance. So I think that's in a pretty good shape if I look at that in comparison to, say, other parts of Europe maybe. So I think it's a pretty good state.
The balance between focusing on the Baltic and controlling the Baltic and on control and then the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic, it used to defend itself because it was ice most of the time. and now we're in a condition where suddenly it's potentially a highway.
Yeah.
And whether it would be used for commercial purposes, and I mean, commercially, the people that we're really interested in are Chinese.
Yeah.
And whether it's necessary that we have some dominant military power that controls it, or whether there is some agreement that it's the high seas and there shouldn't be, anybody that's particular. That's an open area. I'm not qualified to speak about it, but I do know in terms of balance of effort, I think there's, the extent to which Northern European countries think they have to devote naval resources to the Arctic and the extent to which they focus on the Baltic, that's a question that it's a policy question first for them, and then the industrial consequences will follow.
One thing I'd just like to bring in about the Arctic as an operating environment. One of the things we have to think about, I mean, I'm going back to my hobby horse here of the electromagnetic spectrum, but fighting in the spectrum in that part of the world can be difficult because of where you are. You start getting things like the ionosphere, which we depend on for high frequency communications, starts doing very strange things. Satellite communications, believe it or not, is not as comprehensive as it should be in that part of the world. Previous years, we very much focused having, understandably, a global coverage of, for example, for military SATCOM. But one of the things we've done is we've often omitted the poles because there was no real reason to have a lot of coverage up there. That is changing. The US, for instance, is pouring investment into satellite communications in the Arctic. We've got the Canadians who are doing some interesting things. We're looking at over the horizon radar in the Arctic, so to be able to see the threat before it appears on the horizon. But we need to be aware that this spectrum can be a difficult resource to fight through in that part of the world. So we need to think about what we're going to do about that. Whether that's a spectrum-led approach or whether that's more conventional. I'm going to sound very boring, very old-fashioned here. Paper maps and compasses and grease pencils, that kind of thing.
Now, of course, we have another great question that a member of the audience just submitted, and I'm fascinated in this one. As we have this robust conversation on military readiness, a question about our political readiness. Maybe it's about political will a bit more. Do we currently have the political will across Europe that is prepared to respond to the threats at play? I see a head shake at the end. I'm going to put you on the spot. I just couldn't help but notice that.
I mean, personally, I think in some parts of Europe, yes. Yeah. And as we've been speaking on the panel about just now, there is, certainly in the north of Europe, there is a very keen awareness of the threat. You do see more of a whole of society approach in places like Sweden, Finland, the Baltic, etc. If it goes up, we're all going to be involved. But I think in other parts of Europe, that's not the case. I think in other parts of Europe, there is, and in other parts of policies, there is a keenness to avoid conflict. Part of that, I think, is driven to an extent by Afghan and Iraq and our experiences in those theatres. But we mustn't count Russian disinformation, hybrid warfare approaches that if you have, for instance, where I live in France, there's some very strong voices against involvement in Ukraine. But you have to look at who is propelling those voices, who is propelling those arguments. So I think that's...
If you don't mind me asking, you mean who's propelling those political arguments within the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not trying to say sort of Russia's behind everything, but I'm saying there are resources there to help amplify viewpoints that may be saying, let's have less defence spending or whatever it might be. And as an add-on to that, I think the challenge we face in Europe is that in many ways you can't have more defence spending at the expense of something else. People understandably will still want healthcare, education provision, and pensions, whatever it is. So that's why, as you were all saying earlier on, you have to get imaginative about how you spend the money. You have to get collaborative. And that's, I think, how you can sort of square that circle.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, the government has sort of accepted that the way to, if you like, popularise but make acceptable more defence spending is to emphasise its economic benefits, and its economic benefits across the country, including the less well-endowed parts of the economy. and it's pushing that. I mean, I think in the UK there is an acceptance. It's almost where you look in government. There's a readiness to spend more in the Ministry of Defence and press for that, and amongst our defence ministers. But there's a words of caution coming from the Treasury and other parts of government. But I think there is the spending for Ukraine, for instance, which I think is about £3.5 billion a year, which is a chunk of the defence budget. That's unquestioned. Yeah, that's not debated at all.
Yeah, I think the political will is a great question when you look at these arm's length conflicts where you can field your capabilities through a third party. It's quite interesting. As committing your own resources, I think that's something else, and I think the political will is not consistent across Europe. I have quite a deep, strong view about that. But it is very, it's very strong. Maybe up north there's quite a cohesive view. The further east you go, there's a cohesive view. Maybe these border states, border countries, Turkey, for example, they'll think differently because they ride, the east and the west. I think one thing to come back to as well is thinking of what might propel that cohesiveness is that China is involved supporting Russia perhaps with technologies that are eye-wateringly available.
Yeah.
And we must not ever lose sight of that.
Yeah, that is one of the. I felt with China and Russia and the Ukraine conflict, China does not want the Russians to lose.
Correct.
But it does not want the Russians to win either, and that's that's a judgment call from what you observe. But when you think of the long-term implications, it's a big question. The
only thing I would like to add is goes back to what we were saying right at the beginning, is about the speed element, because I think that the longer that this goes on, then the political will or the public support, I think, is only going to probably deteriorate because people get a little bit fatigued. The things are going on. Like time I lived in France, and it's palpable. You can see the way that's declined. So I think this is about industry striking pretty quickly, and really try to make the most of the opportunity that we have. Exactly as Trevor said. I think the smart way is to make this a benefit to the business, to the economy, and to really do it in that way. Otherwise, I think it's there's going to be some challenges.
Sure. I have a personal question for Lieutenant Colonel Otten that has been submitted for you, sir. What is your advice to U.S.-based defense companies with a current manufacturing presence in Europe to accelerate and better support European countries? I'll start with the Lieutenant Colonel. If anyone else has thoughts after that, of course.
Well, if they're that far, they're already doing a fantastic job. So I'd have to try and think about doing that beyond. I don't know. I mean, if you already have a manufacturing facility, it depends. Is that defense industry or that defense company actually working with European militaries and actually selling and getting on contracts? Outside of that, definitely partnering with industry, and I think that's the trend that we're all going to want to see moving forward. And I think I believe we saw that in the UK defense industrial policy that came out 2 days ago about actually having partnerships between industry in different countries and being able to share that technology. It also streamlines that kind of issues sometimes you have with IP, sometimes the issues you have with trade, and that works out. I think, cognizant that we're short on time, I'll add that in the overall scheme of things, open markets amongst allies is one of the most important things we can do to rearm the defense industrial base. We all agree that some level of autarky is not going to get us where we need to get. We need to share the technology. And the example I give on that, for example, is if there's a great company in the UK that's making some great technology and the Ministry of Defense is not ready to procure it, and the US can procure that technology and keep that company afloat and get them across the valley, that's absolutely fantastic. And when we do that collectively, we're going to be stronger. So I do get scared sometimes when people say, sovereign technology. There's a time and place. There's certain technologies, of course, you want to have, but you can't get too far into it. And we haven't talked about it, is leveraging commercial technology is absolutely huge, which is why I'm here. Yes. 75% of the R&D spend in the U.S. is commercial. About 60% of the R&D spend in Europe is commercial. Gone are the days where the government labs are making the best and the government schools are making the best. You have to leverage private or outside academia. You have to leverage outside commercial technology and actually prototype and innovate that to get us there. You've got to expand the defense industrial base collectively across everyone. We have to lower barriers to entry. There's policy things we can do. Back to the political side of the house, we saw it. It has happened somewhat between the U.S., Australia, and UK when we've reduced some of our export controls. But we needed to do that. We need to do more of that. So anyway, kind of a segue for the question. I love to talk to you after the panel if you're in the audience who asked the question on that, because I do have some further thoughts. But again, I know we're short on time. So
no, I appreciate it. I got follow-ups for you after the panel. That was a great answer. And CB looked like you wanted to pop in. You're welcome to do so.
Because I think everything's good, what was just been said, and I can only concur. But the issue becomes, for some people, defense is a jobs program, which means if I can't manufacture in your country, if you want manufacturing in my country, you can't. I'm not interested in your IP. So good idea, great. Put that in a box. Exporting it, great. But I want to make the jobs here.
Yeah.
Which becomes another barrier, and that happens in intra-Europe as well. We all know that each nation state wants to benefit from the defense, the benefits of defense, which is a rich jobs program, and collaboration between industry. It's not happening yet. You mentioned VW and Rearm. That's a great example. It's got to go more of that, much more, and between a company, UK PLC Limited, and the US, rather than it's all must be made here.
But just think about how many of those companies were making technology almost 80 years ago, and they don't anymore.
That's
and
right.
they have some of the best machinists, best engineers, best designers in the world, and it's just this untapped resource that we need.
I'm with you.
Sure.
And I think just kind of on the back of that one, I mean, there is technology available. You made a great point about IP and holding on technology. But, okay, we're a global company. There is, based in the USA, but there's a lot of kind of global technology which is there that people think, that's going to be unexportable. And it's just not true, because a lot of it is based on commercial technology. So there's nothing really that's stopping us from kind of taking that and then modifying it in the right way that our countries over here need to be able to do that. And I think that that's the point. It's probably kind of breaking some of these myths about what is really achievable and what isn't. And I think that, maybe that's education, or maybe it's, but this is really what I was kind of saying. I think that there's a role to play, the lower tiers in the business, where it can really kind of accelerate this and bring it to the market, but still preserve all the good skills and things that we have over in Europe. And
we have just a few minutes, so I'm just going to try and grab in a little bit of a lightning round here at the end, if possible, with you gentlemen. And you don't all have to answer, but if you have an answer, you're welcome to add it. What would you say is the single most important investment that Europe must make in the next 5 years?
Spectrum superiority.
I'm sorry?
Electromagnetic spectrum superiority.
Oh, that's exactly what I figured you were going to say.
Why that predictable?
I had that one perfectly nailed. Anyone else?
I'm into that. I suppose I would say that I would qualify the assumption that we're going to have multi-domain capability, because if we have superiority, it's always going to be temporary. It's not going to be unlikely to be permanent. But I think as I said early on, I think the ability to survey from space better in Europe, and then the ability to have the sort of air defense capability that means the sort of casual, if I call it that, but the casual sort of incidences that we had yesterday in Poland, and to take those out of the equation would be extremely useful.
I'm going to say what they said, plus what they're going to say.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, Europe has made some fantastic investments up to now in platforms and people and projects. It's really good. But let's get it ready to deploy. That the right equipment is at the right place at the right time, and that it works. I think that is really critical, because we've already got a lot of investment. So in the next quick few years, we can do that now. We can do that now with great tools.
Okay.
In addition to what they're about to say.
Of course. If you have anything.
Do you want to go last or me? Okay, for me, I'll keep it really short. I think leading edge, interoperable air and missile defense systems. Yeah.
Initially in my head, I was going to say you can't go wrong with mass articulable autonomous systems across all domains, including space, and the ability to counter them. But the thing I always like to try and remember is that oftentimes conflict can be looked at in my view, who commands the most resources, and that's personnel, equipment, and money. And so you have to balance those things. So, expensive, exquisite systems at the expense of other resources or the personnel. There's just an equation that's got to get worked out.
All right, I got 1 minute left, so 10 seconds from each of you, if possible. In as few words as possible, what does success look like for Europe's industrial base by the year 2030?
Persistent strategic, operational, and tactical overmatch over Russia.
An ability to deter with confidence what Russia could throw at us.
Yeah, I'd say exactly the same. I think it's literally the ability to be totally autonomous and to be able to stand on our own 2 feet as a European region.
Concur with all, add interoperability throughout the continent.
Agile, forward-thinking, and barriers has now been broken down.
All right, well, agile and forward thinking is how I would describe all 5 of you gentlemen. Thank you very much for taking the time to be on stage with us today. One big hand here for our panelists to kick off this morning's broadcast. I feel like I'm in breaking newsroom right now. I'm in broadcast mode. And a very special thank you to all of you. Enjoy the rest of your conference, and we will see you again soon. Thank you, gentlemen.